Today, we're digging into an investigation that alleges a truly massive misuse of public funds in the state of Minnesota. We're not talking about a few isolated cases here. The claim is that this is systemic, widespread fraud. So let's start with the big number.
According to the public estimates cited in the source material, the scale of this alleged fraud is staggering, somewhere around $8 billion of your taxpayer money.
The source doesn't pull any punches. They're making a huge claim that what's happening in Minnesota could be the largest fraud scandal of its kind in American history. A claim like that demands a very close look at the evidence.
So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the core allegation itself. Then, we'll get into the on-the-ground investigation of these so-called ghost businesses. After that, we'll follow the money, see what happened when the system was confronted, and wrap up with the major questions that are still hanging in the air.
Okay, let's start at the beginning. The fundamental accusation here is that billions of dollars in both state and federal taxpayer money are being funneled to fraudulent businesses, specifically in the child care and home health care sectors. The program at the center of all of this is the Child Care Assistance Program, or CSAP. Now, this is a legitimate program designed to help families by subsidizing child care costs. But according to this investigation, it's this very system that's being exploited on a massive scale.
Now we get to the really interesting part. The investigators didn't just look at paperwork, they actually went to the physical addresses of these businesses to see what was really going on.
So let's look at the first case study. You've got two different businesses, Mako and Mini Child Care Centers, but they're both registered to the exact same address. Together, they're licensed to care for 120 kids and have collected millions in public funds over the last few years.
But here's the thing. When investigators went there, they found a building with blacked-out windows. And even more telling, a witness who has been watching this location for 9 years says they have never, not once, seen a child go in or out. Okay, next example. Sweet Angel Childcare. The records show it's licensed for 74 children. It's been paid over $1.2 million just for this fiscal year. But when the investigators showed up, they found one child. Just one. That's a huge gap between the paperwork and reality.
Then you've got this one, the Quality Learning Center. And yes, that's learning misspelled on their own sign. It's licensed for 99 kids and got almost $2 million this year. But a neighbor who's lived there since 2017 says the same thing. They've never seen a single child at the facility.
And this pattern, according to the source, isn't limited to childcare. The same thing is allegedly happening in home health care. They found single office buildings with dozens of separate state-funded healthcare companies registered to them. 14 in one building, 22 in another. It just raises a ton of questions.
So this leads to the obvious question. How is this even possible? How does the money actually move from the taxpayer to these businesses without somebody noticing something's wrong?
Well, the process laid out in the investigation is alarmingly simple. The Department of Human Services gets the public money and then cuts checks to these licensed providers. The providers allegedly just fill out forms for services they never actually performed. And here's the critical breakdown. The state, according to the source, does zero cross-checks to verify that any kids were actually cared for. It's a system that seems to run entirely on paperwork, not proof.
And the investigation connects this alleged fraud directly to the state's finances. You just have to look at the numbers. Just 2 years ago, Minnesota had an $18 billion surplus. Now, it has a $6 billion deficit. That is a $24 billion negative swing, which the source argues is a direct result of all this unchecked spending.
So what happens when these allegations are brought right to the people involved? The investigation documented confrontations with both the business operators on the street and with officials at the state level.
And the responses were, well, telling. On the ground, the operators clammed up, denied knowing anything, or just called the cops. But at the government level, from a state representative, the recorded responses were completely different. It was deflection, blaming partisanship, saying fraud happens everywhere, and suggesting the investigation had political motive.
But here's the counterpoint the source brings up. They cite a specific Minnesota law that says any state employee who knows about fraud is legally required to report it. The argument is that this puts the responsibility squarely on the shoulders of government officials, all the way up to the governor to act on what they're being shown.
And that brings us to the end, where this investigation leaves us with a set of really serious, unresolved questions about who's minding the store.
You know, the key questions really boil down to this.
Where is the basic check to make sure these services are actually being provided? Why are businesses that get cited for violations allowed to just change their name and keep cashing checks? How can dozens of these companies operate out of one building without setting off alarm bells? And maybe the biggest one, who is ultimately responsible for that $24 billion hole in the budget?
And all of this leads to one final critical takeaway. When you have a system that is handing out billions of dollars of public money with no apparent way to verify if anything was done in return, you have to ask a very blunt question. Is that lack of oversight just a flaw, or is it an intentional feature of the system?